All right, well, welcome back. We're ready for the afternoon session here. Good afternoon to those of you in the eastern half of the US, and still good morning for those on the West Coast. I'm Doug Noonan, I'm one of the faculty directors, and it's my pleasure to be the host and MC for this Panel C afternoon discussion. We've got three interesting presentations to look forward to here. The first one we're going to do by Maitwan Nguyen Akbar. Apologies for breaking anybody's last and first names, and Lizzie Melton from the City of Seattle's Office of Arts and Culture, followed by Jeff Cooland, and then Xin Xing Wu from NYU as the third presenter. We'll go for about 20 minutes on each, and then we'll open it up for a bunch of Q&A. I'm sure we're going to have a lot to discuss, so collect your questions, post them into the Zoom chat room if you'd like, and I'll track those and make sure they get asked, or just bide your time. And when we finish the three of them, raise your hand and we will get you a chance to ask your questions to the presenters, and we should have a really interesting discussion. And it'll be even more interesting when I stop talking and hand over the mic to our first presenters from Seattle. You should all have permissions to those presenters to share your screen, so I leave it to you.
Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, or whatever time zone you're in. Lizzie and I have a slide deck, so if you wouldn't mind, we'd like to share our screen. Okay, and feel free to let me know if you cannot see anything.
Looks good.
Okay, awesome. Thanks for having this conference. It's really lovely to meet you all virtually one day, hopefully in person. And again, my name is Maitwan Nguyen Akbar. I'm with the City of Seattle Office of Arts and Culture. The title of our presentation today, it's gone through many life cycles of our titles. Titles are fun. So it's eliminating barriers in the selection process, preliminary findings from our office, as well as just a lot of insights over the years from partnering institutions and community members. We wrote this paper for a particular process in our office, and it just so happened that this conference was another opportunity to share and hopefully receive some feedback today. I'm a sociologist by training. Did my PhD at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and I've been at the office for a little under 4 years. My position started as a Mellon American Council of Learned Societies public fellows position, and it became permanent as of last year. And Lizzie, my co-presenter, and I are dividing up the presentation just to make sure that you hear from different voices in the authors. So I want to kick it off to Lizzie to introduce herself and to introduce the paper and the ideas behind this. And I am the trusty slide advancer.
Thanks, Maitwan. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having us today. My name is Lizzie Melton. I am the panel and data liaison at the Seattle Office of Arts and Culture. So my role, I very much work in support of all of our various selection processes. So teaming up with our project managers who facilitate those processes, and I'm in the room to kind of provide administrative and logistical support. And I also partner very closely with Maitwan in doing some of the impact and assessment work in our office, helping to provide some of the data that comes out of those selection processes to Maitwan for her to do some deep analysis work on. So looking forward to the talk today. So a little bit about our office. So we are located in the lovely King Street Station. There's a photo here for you to see. We moved into that space in 2019. And we also, so this space houses our public art and cultural partnerships programs. We also have a public gallery space as part of King Street Station. And we also operate another facility, the Langston Hughes Performing Arts Institute in Seattle's historic Central District, that is really a hub and centers the Black arts community here in Seattle. And can we jump to the next slide, Maitwan? I want to make sure I didn't miss anything. Yes, and so in alignment with the city's Race and Social Justice Initiative, we work to eliminate institutional racism in our programs, policies, and practices. And that's kind of the part of the driving force behind what we'll be talking about today. And so our guiding principle for organizing both the paper and today's talk is really, why should we care about panel processes? So to ground our work, this paper and our presentation is very much founded in staff wisdom, feedback from communities of color and artists of color, local funders and nonprofits here in Seattle, and as well as some research scans of both regional and national data. We want to start off by acknowledging the staff who have generously shared with us their work and helped develop these promising practices that we're going to be sharing with you today. So these staff members that we work alongside include Irene Gomez, Kathy Shea, Jason Hupp, Maya McKnight, Kristen Ramirez, Diana Falchuk, and Hollis Wong-Ware. They're really the initiators of this work. We are just the communicators. We're working to document the practices that they have developed. This is very much, these are very much their practices that we'll be sharing with you today. And so to give a little more context for what we're going to be discussing, panel processes are often under-considered and frequently hidden behind closed doors. But these processes are used to allocate funding, arts commissions, and other support in the public sector and philanthropy that have significant impact on the types of arts and cultural experiences available to audiences both today and in the future. Such decision-making processes may confer status or legitimacy to practitioners, projects, institutions, and art forms, and as such, continued assessment of these review processes is warranted in the absence of a truly radical shift in the giving sector. So we started with a landscape mapping of regional promising practices and internal case studies from our own office, using both application and nomination-based processes, and preliminary assessment and feedback work to continuously improve these processes. As embedded staff, we're sharing our office's project management promising practices that can be implemented to cultivate decision-making processes that are aligned with values of racial equity and social justice and result in the support of a diversity of artistic and cultural opportunities. So many others have come before us and paved the way for these promising practices, including feedback from organizers and organizations led by Black, Indigenous, and people of color. And today we're going to be sharing a preliminary set of promising practices as they relate to the necessary and aspirational steps in any selection process, led by a jury of peers. We're referring to these kind of interchangeably as reviewers or panelists, and asking in what ways can staff and facilitators of selection processes best support both the panelists and applicants to ensure the most positive experiences for all stakeholders. And second, we're asking, how do we assess the effectiveness of our processes? The significance of our partial answers to these questions can lead us to begin working toward meaningful action steps to address how review processes communicate to current and future audiences about our agency's views and values around cultural policy, and how we as public sector funders can more effectively work to counter implicit bias, racism, and other systems of oppression in our selection and review processes. We're advocating for the diffusion of these promising practices to other departments, peer institutions in the arts, and a call for more transparency in how this work is being done, since it is happening frequently behind closed doors.
Thanks, Lizzie. Because we will be sharing a lot of these 10 promising practices, and we really should have thought about a countdown, Lizzie, like kind of, some excitement and, mystery. But because there's so many, we wanted to make sure that you can see the 10 before we kind of dive for a minute into each of these promising practices. And really, this is a very narrow scope of this overall DEI practice that we're trying to evolve over time in our office. There's so many other aspects to racially equitable grant making and selection processes. So we really wanted to narrow the scope of like start to finish, knowing there's other things you need to do in this selection ecosystem. And Lizzie and I are going to take turns. I'm doing the odds and Lizzie's doing the evens. And it begins with who's in the room and who's able to shape this process of going through people's applications. And there's a formal day where people come together. Obviously, during COVID-19, it was a virtual room. And these panelists, sometimes numbering between 3 to 20 to 26 people, depending on the number of applicants we have, they really shape the conversation around who gets to be vetted through first and second stages. So it's really important you get the right mix of folks in the room with a diversity of perspectives and life experiences. And the least of which is to say we need equitable racial representation of who gets to sit in on these review panels. And it's not enough to have just one person of color on a panel. Ideally, we would have a majority of BIPOC individuals. Here in Seattle, we use the acronym BIPOC, and that's been circulating a lot these past couple of years in US conversations. So have a significant number of underrepresented folks in the room, have them be part of the majority if at all possible, if you can recruit the more number of artists and creatives who are at every stage of their practice, emergent, middle, career, established, and make sure that you're also embedding a set of intersectional identities and experiences in who you're inviting to the table, including across gender, disability status, sexuality, caregiver status, because we also want to make sure that people who are child care and elderly caregivers have an opportunity to participate as well. Obviously, artistic discipline matters depending on the type of opportunity we're giving out. And we have so many throughout the year that there is an opportunity for many folks to kind of on-ramp and to make sure that there's a diversity of educational experiences as well. Not just the formalized educational credential, but also apprenticeship experiences matter, as well as income and so on and so forth. And oftentimes we found that our project managers have gone back into their applicant pool of those folks who were not accepted for a commission, but who made it really close or in the upper quartiles, inviting those folks to get an understanding of what happens behind the scenes there. And then last but not least, and this is highly dependent on budget, and obviously during virtual panels, it's a lot easier to pull this off. But in extending an invitation to people out of state can be hugely rewarding as well for selection panels. Even though we are just City of Seattle, a number of these perspectives can help enrich the arts ecosystem here.
So in convening these processes, we always seek to embed racial justice and inclusion in the project scope right from the very beginning. So acknowledging that the work of dismantling systems of oppression requires a significant investment of time, ensuring that there is both time and space for that work to occur right from the beginning of the project. It's not something that can be added on as a filter later. This is especially important in large-scale projects that might involve many stakeholders. So for example, our public art projects tend to have a large number of people involved in the process. So there are the project managers from our office looking at kind of the artistic side of things. We have the partner agency that is managing the capital project that spins off 1%, in the case of the City of Seattle, 1% for art dollars that are used to fund the public art project. There's community members involved, of course, that live around or work around the area where the project is taking place. There's the artistic community. There might be contractors being brought on by the partner agency, so architects, landscape architects. All of those stakeholders should be involved in the conversation around racial justice and inclusion right from the beginning of the process. We also have found that projects on short timelines do occur sometimes, and the pieces that end up being stripped away in order to move projects forward on a short timeline are precisely these conversations around trust building, deep community engagement, and purposeful inclusion work to support BIPOC artists and creatives. And so using that conversation as a means of kind of pushing back on this need for a short timeline, knowing that the deep community work that we want to do is what is going to suffer when we're moving quickly. We're also recommending taking the time to include anti-bias and anti-racism training specifically suited to the level of your panelists as part of the panelist orientation. So again, they're getting that information right up front before they're moving into the application review process.
Number 3, and some we're going to spend more time on than others, build thoughtful consideration of disability justice and access needs in your process. And we're referring really to all access needs. A question that one of our project managers uses as she's inviting new people into the fold of being on a selection panel is what else do you need to be able to engage as fully as possible in the panel process? Notice that it's a less stigmatizing way of asking the question than, asking people to out themselves and their disability. Think broadly in terms of access for virtual and real life environments. For folks who may identify as having neurodivergent access needs, having clear agendas and a clear timeline and having that written down and sending it out in advance clearly with time budgets. And sharing those materials in advance can really increase that ability for folks to focus and kind of just be their best in selection processes. And obviously, it's really hard to do this, but providing flexibility for those who have different schedules, including those who are taking care of kids, especially during remote schooling times, and those needs of the elderly.
Pre-orientation and orientation meetings are foundational to successful panel processes. So clearly outlining the goals and core values of your project or program right up front, again, especially underlining racial equity and inclusion goals of your program to potential panelists right up front. This gives them the opportunity to hopefully affirm that they're in agreement and in alignment with those goals or core values, or maybe even push further in underscoring those goals and core values. Or if alternatively they're not in agreement, it gives them the opportunity to back out before the panel process begins. This is also an opportunity for folks that are new to the panelist role to ask questions even before that orientation takes place. If you have time, you might even consider convening a workshop opportunity or open forum for potential panelists where they're able to ask questions in kind of a safe environment where they're accompanied by other folks that are new to the process so that they can really learn more about the role upfront before agreeing to step into your process. Creating space in the orientation for panelists to build trust and cohesion with one another, establish group agreements, and develop a shared understanding of their panel process is really crucial. It helps ensure that when they come back together after reviewing applications, panelists are able to share openly and honestly with one another, but also gives them a clear understanding to take with them into that application review process so that they feel that they're equipped and prepared to be able to engage with the materials. For facilitators, the panel orientation is a great opportunity to kind of check in and see what the group dynamics of your panel might be. Are there folks that you're going to need to invite to contribute because they tend to hang back? Are there others who maybe take up more space and will need reminders to share airtime? It's really kind of an opportunity for facilitators to read the room, so to speak, so they can prepare their facilitation strategies for that panel discussion day.
Because I can't see if there's any comments in the chat window, I just want to do a quick time check. I know it's 10:51 in my time zone. So we do have a couple more slides left. Is that cool with the organizers if we continue?
Yeah, if you could speed up to get through these, we should be fine. The chat room's empty right now, but
okay, yeah.
Please go ahead.
Great. Okay, we might skip one or two slides moving forward. I think it's pretty clear that anti-bias training is necessary for those who are on selection panels. This is necessary even for BIPOC folks with lived experience. And we should adapt it to the needs of the panel. A lot of folks have a very deep DEI lens, and so there needs to be maybe higher level order conversations as well.
So using active facilitation to disrupt subtle and overt racism immediately, leaving the failure to interrupt can lead to traumatic experience both for panel participants and the applicants who aren't present in the room to advocate for themselves. We're also advocating in our office for ongoing panel facilitation training and support for staff, and encouraging our staff members who have experience as teaching artists to really bring that teaching artist experience into the panel room with them. Most of our staff are skilled and experienced facilitators, but facilitating a panel is a very specific type of facilitation. So giving staff opportunities to practice and learn continuously from one another is incredibly valuable. And we're also looking at opportunities to provide train-the-trainer opportunities to skill up former panelists who can then become facilitators of their own panels going forward.
There's a lot of moving parts to a selection panel. And so even though it formally ends, there are ways to build community among panelists, and we call that the panel afterlife. Invite them back to your events, try to build community between the awardees and those who are part of the selection process. Next.
So a big topic in our office at the moment is reframing notions of conflict of interest in order to keep community insight and expertise in the room. Conflicts of interest have historically been defined using Western standards of ties through money, family, and positive negative relationships. We're working to move away from that kind of false binary by asking, how do we ensure that the panelist expertise stays in the room? The community connection and wisdom and knowledge that the panelist brings with them into the panel room is typically precisely why they were invited to be a panelist in the first place. And so how do we ensure that we're not using that false binary around conflict of interest to unnecessarily exclude folks from contributing to the discussion?
A 9 is a big one for me in my role as impact and assessment manager for our office, and that is using human-centered design thinking and continuous waves of light touch assessment. We try to at least rigorously collect individual level applicant race and to reflect that back on aggregate to those who are on the selection panel. And that requires a very thoughtful way to embed using race data into conversations that move beyond tokenism. We want to be cognizant of who is missing in selection panels, who's missing in the room, and who is missing in our applicant pool, obviously. We try to build in a debrief process whenever possible after the selection process. And overall, trying to examine panel processes office-wide in the many different opportunities that we engage in throughout the year. And to also own up to any mistakes that are made and turn those into continuous learning opportunities for our own staff. And that really requires a lot of trust and comfort in being vulnerable. So we also have introduced over the past 2 or 3 years an exit survey that people anonymously fill out. And obviously that data gets looked at and conveyed back to project managers by Lizzie.
And lastly, I think something that we've seen particularly during COVID, deploying emergent strategy to adapt and transform in response to change. So have a plan for your panel process, but also be prepared to shift in the moment in response to new ideas, feedback, and needs. So facilitators need to pay attention to the room, verbal and nonverbal signs of discomfort with the process, and asking how can we shift and adapt when the process is not supporting participants. If you haven't already, we're highly recommending reading Adrienne Murray Brown's book on the topic, Emergent Strategy, as really a guide to navigating change.
So that is our 10. We cut out the part of our paper that was like the lit review and best practices research we did in the scan, but hopefully with access to our paper, you can read more deeply into that. The future of cultural policy beyond the here and now requires obviously a lot more expansive thinking and deep listening beyond the frameworks that we presented here. But if the goal is to rebalance the future of the arts funding landscape, we really need to be able to build in policies, practices, and procedures that can uplift communities historically denied to funding and representation. And obviously, these are just one step in that ongoing continuum to reach what our city refers to as the Race and Social Justice Initiative that's been around for about 20 years now. And we thought it would be remiss not to share some art. So here's our COVID-19 pivot in public art, which is the art in your front yard with 3 of the 11 or so artists that we contracted. And there's like thousands of these posters throughout the city. So with that, we're gonna end it here. Really apologies for going over time. We just had so much content, and we're also looking forward to listening to our panelist papers. Thank you. Stop sharing now.
Awesome. All right. Well, thank you. Very interesting stuff, of course, and it inspires many questions, which we're going to get to, because I want to be able to talk more about the importance of these processes for selecting, awardees and where the funding goes is critical to answering these questions about what are we going to be sort of preserving or supporting for future generations, get implicitly answered to the choice we make about how we run these processes. So the hows and the pragmatics are terribly important. So we'll circle back to these, but let's get our next speaker a chance to go. This is Jeff Cooland. If he's around, we'll pass the mic over and you can share screen or take over and I'll shut up. Go for it. Welcome.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Doug, for the introduction. I'm really pleased to be sharing a presentation today. It should be popping up on your screen here momentarily. That's titled Cultivating Creativity in Youth Through Arts Education ICH Programs, especially through times of crisis. And I will be very transparent with you all. It has been a crazy few days and I'm coming out of meetings. So doing my best to transition into a conference presentation mode and to share a little bit about our work over the last 12 to 15 months. So we at Creative Generation are dedicated to the development of thriving communities in a more just world. And we do that by working to inspire, connect, and amplify the social justice work of young creatives, as well as those who are committed to cultivating their creativity, primarily artists, educators, and social activists. During the next few minutes, I'd like to share a little bit about our work at Creative Generation, which will set the stage for our research that ended up occurring in 2020. I'd like to intertwine some of our learning from 3 different studies that were conducted during the pandemics being a plural word, of 2020, and their responses specifically to crisis, to adaptations that were implemented, and the perceived impacts by young people in the US and globally. And then finally, I'd like to present my findings and recommendations for the potential futures of arts education and ICH programs, particularly through the lens of cultural policy moving forward. So just to set some common language, we at Creative Generation subscribe to a couple of different ideas. One is the concept that within cultural policy, there are several domains, including arts and cultural education. So when we talk about policy recommendations, we talk about both capital P policy, meaning federal policy, state policy, local public policies in both the arts and culture and education spaces, but also those lowercase policies, meaning the cultural policies of a program or an organization. And particularly in a decentralized cultural policy landscape like the United States, that's a really important distinction to see how those interplay with cultural diplomacy, support for artists and arts organizations. Secondly, we looked at a couple of different programs in looking at intangible cultural heritage, or ICH programs, that were aimed at young people, arts education programs in the formal setting, K through 12, as well as creative youth development programs. Now, I understand that there are differences between these. For sake of time, let's not get into that and just understand that all three have certain coalescence around the idea of the development of creative capabilities and cultural identity through artistic learning. So to begin, Creative Generation emerged out of a number of conversations that formed around a critique of the narratives of arts education in about 2018 and 2019. So I myself used to work for a National Arts Service organization that propelled language that was a little bit esoteric and a little bit neoliberal in its approach about the benefits of arts education, aligning to certain values of perceived gatekeepers and public policy and funding and so forth. And my perception really changed on this day. The graphic here on the screen depicts a March for Our Lives. There's a young woman, a student from Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School, a survivor of the shooting there, standing on a stage with the US Capitol in the background singing. This event, A March for Our Lives, to me was the true demonstration of the power of arts education. It allowed for these young people to cultivate their creativity in such a way that they could apply it to change the narrative around school safety and gun rights in this country, leading one of the largest marches on Washington since Martin Luther King. These are not the types of outcomes that we talked about when we talk about arts education in the United States public policy discourse, but instead it gave us a real shining example of what theater and music programs in this one high school can do to equip young people to respond to the challenges that they face in their worlds. So at Creative Generation, we got started on a multi-phase research process that was disrupted in March of 2020, like many of you probably could imagine. In the first phase, we looked at the description of the work and its outcomes of artists and educators and community organizations, that what they do to cultivate creativity in the next generation. Then as we began to understand the work and its outcomes, we looked at effective strategies of cultivating creative capabilities in young people. And then thirdly, we specifically looked at how all around the world, young people are supported in their pursuit of creative social transformation, how adults, such as artists and educators and community organization leaders, are supported in their work. And lastly, how the strict systems need to change in order for youth and adults to be able to navigate them better. And it was during this process that 2020 happened, and we ended up pivoting a lot of our research to understand the innovations that occurred in response to the crises of 2020 and the impact of this creative generation on the world moving forward. So to give us a little bit of background, our initial findings around the dominant narratives was that there was tremendous literature that focused on the instrumental benefits of arts and cultural education, particularly for low-income students, comparing those with high participation in the arts versus those with low participation, aligning to certain gatekeeper held outcomes like dropout rates or standardized tests or attendance and completion of college, which we all know are not actual indicators of human development or lifelong learning. But instead, we found that there were arts and education leaders from around the world that felt that these were demonstrative, that they were not what was actually occurring on the ground in communities, and that there was a desire to rewrite these narratives, particularly through the lens of those who controlled public policy and funding. So we offered some new language. We took from the Global South and we adapted terminology around social transformation, which refers to the processes of changing institutionalized relationships, norms, values, and hierarchies over time. And this is something that a lot of arts and culture organizations, artists in particular, are focused on doing, but we didn't really have language for this. So we offer a term called creative social transformation, which is creative approaches to changing these norms, relationships, and hierarchies. But we really needed to understand what creative meant. And in this, we returned to the literature and found some really great language that was popular in the early 2000s, particularly in Europe, that described a certain segment of our population as the creative generation, or Gen C. This term, which was taken from consumer marketing, is often used to describe an intergenerational group of people, aged 8 to 80, says the literature, that have common creative capabilities, such as creative thinking, cultural consciousness, connectivity, and concern for community. And we hypothesize that they employ these creative capabilities to catalyze that social transformation, thus creating that creative social transformation. So in identifying these creative capabilities, which are defined here on the screen, we were able to focus our energy on a number of programs, 30 in particular, from 24 different nations, to understand exactly how they were doing this work. And what we found was that through several paradigm shifts in pedagogy and organizational policy, as well as practice in the community, that ultimately there was a new theory of change that with adults such as ourselves, artists, educators, community organization leaders, dedicated to cultivating creative capabilities in young people, such as that creative thinking, cultural consciousness, connectivity, and concern for community, those young creatives perform acts of creative social transformation that develop thriving communities and a more just world, which are often measured through well-known sets of literature in community development, economic development, international development, or youth development. So what we're offering here is a new terminology to describe a phenomenon that we've been seeing for years, to throw out a restrictive set of public and organizational policies that don't allow young people to thrive, and to allow for young creatives to take the lead and to foster social and systems change. Then we hit March 2020, where there was a global health pandemic, an economic recession that resulted from that global health pandemic. There was a racial reckoning in the United States and abroad that responded to the violence against our Black communities, and there was political unrest responding to the rise of our nationalistic elected officials. Now, in this time, we partnered with a couple of different organizations, primarily Wolf Brown, and conducted some new research. We did first a fast response survey for public policy and funding mechanisms to see how the field felt that they should be responding to the COVID-19 pandemic, and produced a report. We conducted a global campaign called #KeepMakingArt, engaging almost 1 million practitioners around the world, collecting articles about their early responses to the pandemic in March and April. We then followed 41 programs, particularly in the creative youth development field, about their response between March and September, documenting those practices and writing several articles for a special issue of Arts Education Policy Review, as well as conducting a review of good practices identified by UNESCO during International Arts Education Week. And finally, we conducted a study of youth-led place-based creative projects that were aimed at community development and how they responded to the crisis. Today, we continue to monitor and identify various practices to help the field continue to move forward, much of which I'll share today. Our first insights were gained from those 41 creative youth development programs that designed for us an articulation visually of how they responded. Tied to some of the literature around risk-taking, we found that these programs participated in two different paths. Here in this graphic, you'll see the comfort zone at the center, fear and uncertainty zone, of which they were launched into as a response to the crisis, insight and learning, and sustained opportunity. And in this, we found programs operated in two scenarios. Either the short circuit scenario, where they fought back as hard as they can to return to what they knew how to do, what they felt good about doing, and others that harness those insight and learnings that they gained from their crisis or their disruption, and moved into what we call the sustained opportunity zone, which allowed programs to innovate and respond better to meet the needs of young people in their communities. Secondly, we asked over time a series of questions. How were these programs responding? What were the questions that they were asking over time? And these fell into 5 categories. They were internally reflecting and gaining insights. They were taking a moment to pause to think. They were building productive new collaborations, such as with the city's health agency. They were strengthening their program design, particularly in the virtual setting. They were improving organizational stability and sustainability, and by diversifying funding primarily. And they were instigating shared leadership, taking this moment to share power among young people and family members. Secondly, we looked at these good practices from around the world. These were identified by UNESCO, and we were able to look through the documentation that they created and found, again, several findings. First was that around the world, programs understood their interdependence on digital delivery and the internet. It not only allowed for safe distancing during the health crisis, but also allowed for the democratization of learning and knowledge consumption, particularly in rural environments. Second, organizations were able to connect their work to the pressing needs of young people in communities, moving away from their organizational strategic plans and actually responding to the needs of young people, like their mental and physical well-being. And third, organizations were conducting themselves with humility, focusing on the empowerment of other educators outside of their organizations, which was previously unheard of, such as parents or community elders, to allow for that arts education to continue in their homes. And finally, we conducted a study where we worked with and coached 9 youth researchers and documentarians around the United States that were leading arts-based, youth-led, place-focused projects that intersected with various fields like public safety, racial justice, immigration, agriculture, the environment, education reform, and more. These young people articulated the impact of their programs, particularly in the year leading up to and throughout the crisis. It's amazing what they said. It aligns with what we know from certain monumental reports in the early 1990s, talking about the intrinsic or the instrumental value of the arts. However, what's notable here is the way they articulated it was through a third axis, adding a third dimension to the impact of their creative work, the community axis, where they talk about the impact on place, being physical, and the impact on people in those places. This allowed for them to more aptly describe the outputs of their work and the impacts that they had in their community. Sometimes it was private, personal, and intrinsic. Other times it was instrumental, public, and place-based. Regardless, though, these young people felt that their dimensions of impact had multiple impacts among the realms of people in their community. Here's one illustration that goes from the creative process at the very center, radiating out through the art making, through the intersection with other fields, and ultimately to the broader community stakeholders. This one example was from a program that was called Dance for Social Change in New Orleans, Louisiana, where young Black dancers were grappling with issues of gentrification and displacement by not only studying that topic, but allowing for their dance to end up making a dance festival that was presented to the city's housing authority. They were able to not only see their creative process between themselves and their choreographers, but among their peers, with their schools, other arts organizations, artists, friends, families, and with those community stakeholders broadly. What they found is that they were instrumental in creating those multiple dimensions of impact on themselves, on the people in their communities, on their physical places, and on public policies. They were also demonstrating through this process the many other findings that we had. They were innovating through the crisis, they were gaining new insights and implementing them on the spot, and they were relying on a greater democratization through the internet, through their rural communities outside of New Orleans, and much more. What they articulated was that there were many new ways that we need to be talking about the outputs of arts and cultural education programs. They're listed here, and this was consistent across the 9 case studies that we did. They range from intergenerational cultural continuity, we saw this on a reservation in South Dakota, to building interpersonal and collective bonds and rethinking civic and cultural institutions. And ultimately what we found is that through these 41 United States-based creative youth development programs, through this global survey of good practices by UNESCO, and through these youth-led creative projects for social change, that over the course of 2020, we were able to see major shifts that we would advocate need to be implemented for the potential futures of arts and cultural education, particularly through the cultural and public policy lenses. That organizations need space to revisit their moral compass. They need time to reflect and articulate their values. We need to increase power sharing and allow for the democratization of power between educators and young people, parents, and communities. We need to enable environments for social inclusion, going beyond DEI to actually break down the barriers. We need to strengthen program design through technological advances, build on those technology literacies that were implemented by necessity in 2020. That we should continuously respond to the changing needs of young people. Forget your strategic plan, be responsive to the young people in front of you. That we should focus on mental and health and mental well-being for young people and their families. That we should increase participation in civic dialogue. Enough of art for art's sake, art for civics sake. And finally, we need to develop new collaborations that allow all of these to foster and grow generatively, whether that is through health or civic engagement or other sectors that affect those young people in our communities. I know that's a ton of information. I hope that I was able to cover it in a somewhat succinct way, and I look forward to the dialogue because this is really just the start. These are bold questions, big assertions, and we really hope that it can foster new dialogue to develop the cultural policies that will serve young people in the future.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And we're going to keep things moving by moving on to Dr. Wu at NYU, who I hope was ready, but that was very, very interesting and very informative, Jeff. So thank you. Xinqing, are you ready?
Yes.
Fantastic. All right, away you go. Thank you.
Okay, let me just get myself situated. Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Xinqing Wu. I'm currently a research affiliate at NYU. I would like to thank the Center for Cultural Affairs at the O'Neill School of Public and Environmental Affairs at the Indiana University for inviting me to present this paper titled Development and Application of the Cultural Policy Typology of Principal Value, a policy typology for the arts and culture. My presentation today will be based on this outline. This paper is based on part of the research result I conducted on the Massachusetts Cultural Council, the MCC. For those who are not from the US, the MCC is an official state cultural arts agency in the state of Massachusetts. Culture is an indispensable part of society. It contributes to the advancement and continuity of civilizations. In recent years, cultural policy has been attracting more attention from the field of policy studies in the US. Regional, state, and local governments are recognizing the positive effects of culture by getting involved. There is a public interest in this burgeoning field and a need for more research. The US culture policy is characterized by its decentralized federal system. In this way, states and municipalities, as the subnational units of the government, play a major part in the ecology of the cultural sector. State governments and their respective state arts cultural agencies have been players of increased prominence in support of the sector. Like other forms of policy, governance in relation to culture suggests a particular objective or goal that contribute to a desired course of events. Moreover, whatever governments choose to do or not to do can produce intended or unintended outcomes. Therefore, examining the potential effects of governmental policy on culture can reveal its values and the power relation of its politics. But the existing literature is limited in its discussion of cultural policy at the state level. Therefore, the primary aim of this paper is to present a cultural policy typology using a case study of a state arts cultural agency in order to enhance the theoretical understanding of differing cultural policy goals. This proposed typology focuses on classifying policy by goal variation. After it was developed, this typology was then fielded as part of a larger study which examined the role of Massachusetts Cultural Council, MCC, in state cultural policy. Specifically, the typology was used to assess the policy goals of the MCC in order to answer this research question. What are the policy goals of the Massachusetts Cultural Council? By emphasizing certain policy goals, a government promotes specific forms of expression and activities over others, and therefore shapes the landscape of the field. Policymakers and practitioners in the fields of arts and culture could benefit from this new typology when communicating their organizational objectives to stakeholders. In practice, intentionally or unintentionally, the action and inaction of a government produce its cultural policy. According to Rentschler, an intentional policy refers to, quote, governmental strategies and activities that promote the production, dissemination, marketing, and consumption of the arts, end of the quote. On the other hand, an unintentional type, according to Schuster et al., refers to the implicit goal that is covertly attached to a policy. Nevertheless, the lack of a universally agreed upon definition of relevant dimensions and key terms is an ongoing challenge observed in the study of cultural policy. The literature identifies several types of goals in cultural policy. One variety is specifically public-oriented because it underlies several public values, as pointed out by DiMaggio, including excellence, conservation, access, participation, innovation, pluralism, and diversity. In addition, as observed in the official language of the United Nations, this type of policy also emphasizes the notions of cultural diversity, rights, and heritage. Then, in recent decades, cultural policy has become more market-oriented. Seen in this light, culture is part of the creative industry and is a means to aid other economic development efforts, such as urban revitalization. And so, artists are critical in this economy. According to Markuson and Schwab, artists are the main contributors of artistic dividend because they provide means not only through their work, but also by drawing outside audiences to their local communities. For some, these arguments about economic impact are very appealing talking points when it comes to the rationales of government support for the arts and culture. Others are concerned that these effects are overstated. As Sterngold pointed out, it creates a biased environment which favors activities or institutions capable of bringing in large amount of short-term financial gains and ignores those, quote, smaller and locally oriented organizations that may contribute more to a community's quality of life and long-term development, end of the quote. To address such a shortfall, an alternative is to view culture as one of the significant variables associated with the development policy beyond the economy. UNESCO is one of the prominent advocates for this type of cultural policy. In recent years, governments in the US and around the world, especially at the local level, have been tapping into the notion of cultural-centered sustainable development in order to transform their communities into creative cities. The movement grows out of the discussion of creative placemaking, where, as Markuson and Gangway indicated, quote, partners from public, private, nonprofit, and community sectors strategically shape the physical and social character of the neighborhood, town, city, or region around arts and cultural activities, end of the quote. Despite the fact that cultural policy takes many forms, its discourse is nevertheless sporadic. This is attributed to the fact that existing models of public policy typology are not sufficient or appropriate for analyzing the varying usage of culture. For such a specialized field, it is paramount to create a typology to help characterize cultural policy according to its intended goals and associated values. To address this gap in knowledge, this paper presents a typology and applied it as a tool to examine the policy goals of a state arts cultural agency. As part of a larger study conducted between 2015 and 2017, I presented this typology as part of the interviews with 15 individuals, including 14 staff members working at the Massachusetts Cultural Council and one longtime board member of the agency. The larger study was designed to investigate the status of state cultural policy in Massachusetts with a focus on the role of the MCC. The typology was presented as a handout and definitions were provided for each policy type. During the interviews, all participants were asked to identify the MCC's grant programs based on the available policy categories in this typology. Among them, 9 individuals were further asked to score the MCC's overall objectives using a 10-point scale in accordance with the presented typology. This additional scaling system was adapted as a way to correlate with the participants' responses shared in the interviews. Although not included in my paper, I would like to provide a bit more detail about the larger study for the context. The reason that Massachusetts and its designated state arts cultural agency, the Massachusetts Cultural Council, was chosen because the state is a unique case. It is among the top 5 states with the largest number of cultural organizations based on the 2015 data of the National Center for Charitable Statistics. Among states with similar population sizes, it has the highest number of cultural organizations per capita. Based on the literature review, I conceptualized a model to categorize cultural policy goals according to their benefits and the societal attitude toward the role of the government. It is defined by 2 dimensions, intrinsic versus instrumental value, and neoliberal versus public policy orientation. One of the dimensions is expressed by the role of public policy in democratic society versus a neoliberal capitalist economy. On this spectrum, some types of policy are designed to safeguard public value while others promote market profit. The other dimension is defined by the use of culture, either valuing it by its inherent quality or treating it as a means to an end. On one side of the scale, culture is affirmed by its intrinsic value because it embodies the quintessential element of human experience. On the other hand, distinguished from the intrinsic argument, the emphasis is on its instrumental functions. I named this model the cultural policy typology of principal value. It classifies cultural policy into 4 self-metrics along these 2 dimensions: neoliberalism against the public orientation and instrumentalism against intrinsic value of culture. Based on this conception, there are 4 types of cultural policy. The instrumentality neoliberal approach emphasizes the functionality of culture to advance the economy. The instrumentality public approach, in contrast, focuses on instrumentalism but is grounded by the orientation of public value. Opposite these programmatic views, the culture-centered public approach champions the intrinsic quality of culture to humankind. The focal point of this method is to safeguard the inherent value of culture that is not prioritized in a market economy. Finally, fully subscribe to the principles of a free market. The cultural-centered neoliberal approach considers culture as simply a kind of commodity. This model is all about private consumption and contribution. During my interview, the respondents were presented with a summary sheet of the 4th style of cultural policy and asked to classify the agency's grant according to these categories. Based on the perceptions of the interviewees, the MCC's programs were codified using the cultural policy typology of principal value. Specifically, keywords from the interview responses were identified to help link these programs to the 4 policy types. For example, participants describe a program having the following features: access and diversity, community development and education, and cultural economic impact. Using the terms of the typology, the keyword access and diversity can be interpreted as a form of cultural-centered public policy. The phrase community development and education as an instrumentality public policy, and the expression cultural economic impact as an instrumentality neoliberal policy. This table summarizes the grant programs by policy goal, that is, the kinds of activity they fund, the nature of the grant, meaning the ways they are awarded, grantee type, and cultural policy typology. As shown, the MCC's grant program are classified under the cultural center public, the instrumentality public, and the instrumentality neoliberal approaches. Overall, the interviewees had an impression that the MCC equally emphasizes the cultural center public and the instrumentality public approaches. Interestingly, many of them believe that the focus on instrumentality neoliberalism had not been as strong as that of the other 2 approaches. This figure shows the ways in which a sub-sample of 9 participants scored the overall objectives of the MCC using a 10-point scale. The higher the scores means higher alignment of the MCC's goals to a certain cultural policy type. The graph shows the average scores marked by the participants. An intriguing detail about the data is that although no participant directly identified any of the MCC's program as cultural center neoliberal, some of them still gave few points to this type of policy when they were asked to score the overall objectives of the MCC. The case of the MCC provides a real-life application of a novel system of classification. This model, the cultural policy typology of principal value, helps categorize policy goals more effectively. As an organization, the MCC clearly aims to achieve certain objectives. The finding shows that its policy goals are rather broadly defined. An interesting point was brought up by the interview result. There was a belief that the MCC was gradually moving away from instrumentality neoliberalism. For a long while, instrumentality neoliberalism has been a core argument for public investment in the cultural sector. Many of the interviewees admitted that it was hard not to talk about the economic benefits when communicating with the elected officials. Also, a couple of the interviewees expressed their skepticism that they thought this move away from economic argument was merely symbolic. However, as I wrap up my fieldwork in June 2017, the MCC had effectively ended its Adams Arts program, which was grounded on the instrumental value of culture for local economic development. Furthermore, the MCC had added a few services called EBT Card to Culture, an initiative offering food stamp holders discount or free admission to various arts and cultural events. Another intriguing part of the finding shows that a subsample of the participants gave some points to the cultural center neoliberal approach as part of the objectives of the MCC. However, when they were probed further, they could not provide any example of this policy type using the Council's grants programs. This discrepancy could be attributed to the fact that the overall environment of the US encourages private demands on consumption of arts and culture forms in accordance with free market rule. As part of the US cultural sector ecology, a governmental agency such as the MCC may be perceived to be part of this environment centering on private demands and consumption. Finally, beyond the case of the MCC or other state art cultural agencies, the cultural policy typology of principal value could be adapted by nonprofit institutions in the analysis of their programming. Cultural organization can potentially use this framework to get a better understanding of their values and offering by integrating the typology into a SWOT analysis for strategic planning. To summarize, in response to the research question, the MCC's policy could be categorized into the instrumentality neoliberal, the instrumentality public, and the cultural center public approaches. While slightly shifting away from the economic argument, the MCC remains even more strongly committed to its cultural center public and instrumentality public policies. The use of this new typology could help advance the knowledge of cultural policy decision-making at all governmental levels. It lays out a conceptual guide to assist the relevant stakeholders to choose the specific types of cultural policy that will accommodate the distinct needs of their community. Thank you. And please feel free to stay in touch if you're interested in the larger study. Wait.
Very good. Thank you. Thank you very much. Yes, and for everybody, feel free to put your comments and questions in the chat or raise your hand. We'll open the floor up now for some questions to our speakers. There's lots of good stuff in there, of course. And we did touch on a number of different topics, from sort of conceptual frameworks to applied processes for things, and then a bit in the middle as well. And if I don't see any questions coming up now, I'm going to start off with a question. And I want to go back to the Seattle group that starts this off with a question about the tensions between a pragmatic, practical realities of running panels and the ideal world. I think I heard that, we want equitable racial representation. We want over 50% BIPOC represented, but we don't want to tokenize. And I listen to your talk and I see a paper that lists a lot of different identifiers. So the ideal panel is about how large? In the hundreds? What's the practical implications of this for running a panel?
That is a great question, Doug. And obviously we can't have 100 panelists on any particular grant or public art commission or what have you. It is really about striking a balance and being intentional in who you start inviting off first, right? Like, we get rejected by people who just say, I'm sorry, we don't have enough time for serving on this panel, even though it is a paid opportunity, by the way. And we try to streamline our payment processes of how we compensate people fairly for their time. On a panel of 5, it would be great to have someone representative of the multiple communities that are in Seattle, including Native Indigenous communities, African American, Black, diasporic, Pacific Islander, Asian American. And once you have made an attempt to have that diversity of representation, also make sure that we aren't going to the same people over and over again, right? Like, as sometimes we're want to do because we want to invite, we're oftentimes aware of who's served well on a panel, but you want to bring opportunities to new folks coming into the fold. I don't know if Lizzie, who supports every single panel, also wants to chime in here.
Thanks, Maitwan. No, I mean, I think that's right. We are very limited. Most of our, I think, as Maitwan said, most of our panels are in the 3 to 7 person range. But I think, like, really looking holistically at each person we're inviting, acknowledging that, like, we're inviting people into the room to bring all of their expertise, and expertise framed incredibly broadly, whether that's like artistic expertise or lived experience expertise, and recognizing that people can hold multiple intersecting forms of expertise, and how do we bring as many of those intersections into the room as possible. I think our one of our colleagues really underscored the importance of acknowledging that the more intersections of identities we have present in the room, the richer the conversation, the more robust the conversation. It limits the potential areas of under awareness present in the room. And so I think it's important to look holistically both at the individuals and the composition of the panel overall.
Yeah, no, and I recognize this is tough because at one point you said, you don't want to have just the one representative of a particular racial group. You want sort of redundancy, but you have to maximize diversity in a finite panel size. You don't have that luxury. And so there's clearly going to be those kinds of trade-offs and challenges. So thank you for the thoughtful response, or putting you on the spot there to start things off. Michael Rushton, and then we'll go over to Bill Ivey next. We'll get you unmuted here in a second, Michael.
I'm old. Okay, so anyway, can you hear me now? It's come up a few times today, and it's something I've pondered actually for a long time, and it's come up again and again today. And so I'm just going to put this out there for anybody who wants to answer it. In the context of cultural policy, what does the word neoliberal mean?
I can start, Michael, by saying I don't want to answer that, but I would say that in the context of my presentation, I was actually coming from the neoliberal education approach, in the sense of, I would cite Stephen Ball in that, but that was sort of my approach there. But anyone else is welcome to answer the cultural policy portion of it.
Well, I'll say something. I think of neoliberalism as the post-World War II, post-Keynesian ideology that sort of follows communism and socialism and other isms that attempted to explain the way the economy connected with society. And it has to do with privatization, small government, viewing the social environment as one of struggle, competition, and in which economic factors influenced by merit create outcomes, and that the government takes a hands-off approach, and I think and favors market solutions. This is true of road building. This is true of, you just push things out into the market, assuming that will produce the best outcomes. And I think it was viewed as an alternative to, or a successor to, some of the other isms that dominated economic thinking in maybe a pre-World War or an international depression era. But I think the implication for the nonprofit arts is that you're encouraged to be entrepreneurial and act like a private sector actor, as opposed to an arm of government policy that's working with government resources to carry out public objectives. And so I think I always think of the nonprofit model that was so glorified by McNeil Lowry at the Ford Foundation, because it was going to produce better artistic outcomes, because it would be free of the competitive factors of the marketplace. And of course, almost as that idea was being really launched, the nonprofit organization, driven by a brilliant, free, creative director, I think the nonprofit model fell prey to neoliberal objectives, which is it was encouraged to be competitive, entrepreneurial, not dependent on government largesse, and so on. So that's the way I don't know, others could debate me, but neoliberalism has the great advantage of never having fully labeled itself the way communism and socialism and other ideologies did. And so it kind of has a stealth but very powerful presence. So
well, other people label it. So that's what I want to know. It's what other people
well, that's what that's my, and you know, that everybody's favorite Foucault had, he did lectures at a Paris university, I think in December of 1979, in which he kind of defines neoliberalism. I mean, that's really before Thatcher and Reagan and all that showed up in public policy. And his formulation is really interesting. I don't totally agree with it, but it's really pretty smart, and it's easy to find. I think people should look at it. But I'll stop there. I mean, that's just my take. Others go.
I don't want to take up the whole Q&A period with it, but I just I hear
a question
what I think people mean in different ways. So I'll let you ask a new question. So.
Yeah, I want to ask Dr. Wu about typology, and two parts of the question. One is, does your research indicate that the typological formulations are intentional on the part of organizations? That is, we sit back and we decide that if we frame our explanations in a certain way, it will have some kind of positive outcome. So that's part A of the question. And then part B is, if you looked at organizations that had multiple functions, they did music, they did dance, they did literature programming, or folk arts out in communities, did you find that within an organization there might be different typologies that would be used to frame parts of a program rather than the whole thing? Or did the research not penetrate that far into the work of organizations?
I would say it didn't really go that far. Let me answer the second question. And because my idea was to really try to develop a framework, so I will be able to kind of see what the focus would be for a state arts agency. But I definitely also, one thing that I didn't mention in my presentation is that these policy types are not mutually exclusive. It's not mutually exclusive. So for instance, one of the MCC's program, people connected to all three types. So I feel like it's more about it's a useful tool, because when you have that kind of a goals in your mind to think about what kind of potential. It is kind of connected, I think, answering to your first question, is that it is connected to a certain outcome, although my research couldn't capture the actual outcome because that was beyond the scope, although that would be interesting to kind of see in the future. But I think at least from the perspective of for the state agency, it's important for them to capture what they hope to do, and then to use that as a tool to kind of effectively communicate with their stakeholder, the funders, and then also, and ultimately, I think the interesting thing also I found is that you cannot just focus on one type, because that is it won't make you survive in this in right now. You really have to be broad. When you have a broad focus, then that's when you can really communicate to a broad range of stakeholder and ultimately build up a better, a larger constituency. And that's exactly what actually MCC end up as part of my research. I think because their focus is so broad, and I think their name is also kind of different from the other state agency, because the other like talks about the art, like seems to focus on the arts more. And then so I feel like having the broad focus really gave them the advantage in that sense. I hope that answered your question.
The discussion, when I was reading your paper especially, there was an interesting point about how there was sort of balance across the 4 quadrants of this typology in terms of the programs, but then someone else remarked that it was actually the more economic minded in sort of creative industry style programs that actually accounted for most of the spending. And so then it got me thinking that if you looked from an organization, any organization's perspective across that typology, and you place their various sort of investments like a portfolio across those quadrants, some would specialize in one quadrant, some might in a couple, some might try to do a bunch. And if you weighted those investments by dollars, it might look very different than just the sheer number of investments, but that dollar weighting is just one metric. And if we think about intangible heritage, to bring it back to sort of today's theme, a lot of the intangible heritage pieces are not going to be well reflected in a metric of dollars and in mere economic throughput kind of metrics. And so it'd be interesting as we start thinking about other metrics in which we might see intangible heritage score a lot higher, or tilt the balance. If we weight things, it'll tilt the balance in very different directions. And that might be part of the tension with this neoliberal bit, is that we do get caught up in dollars, but in fact, the value of recipes and language goes way beyond what we're actually measuring with marginal analysis through dollars in the economic piece. And it may be our own failings for failing to appreciate and properly appreciate all of that. Not really a question, just a thought.
I think that's so great, because I didn't include my paper, but I realized I should point it out in my presentation today about they ended the Adams Arts program, which was their really the poster boy of their economic development program. But they decided to end it, I think because they realized that they don't want to go too, if you go too deep in that area, you're gonna be all the other good works you do with public value is gonna be drowned out by that. So I think they were really conscientious, picking to focus back the public value.
Can I actually
pause for other questions? Jeff, please.
Yeah, I was just saying, Doug, I really appreciate that. And I just want to reflect one example. So when we were working on the third study that I talked about, which was called Creative Youth and Community Development, it was the very last funded project of Art Place America as they sunset. And we worked with a young person in Richmond, Virginia. The program works with formerly incarcerated youth to reform the justice system through their visual art programs. And it was funny, we were asking this individual to articulate, to visualize through pen and paper, the impacts. And we wanted to turn it into, the word that we were using was a typology. And he sort of went on this rant and said, with a lot of colorful language that I'll spare you today, like, what is the purpose of this? Like, I don't even understand. You just want to, spend your time and spend your money creating these diagrams for no good reason. And it really caused us, which is why we focused on like bringing it down, or bringing it to a new place, I should say, because so much of what we focused on, not only on that project, but truly in all of our work through Creative Generation, is what do we actually do with these theoretical models? How can they provide that language for people to use? Because when we reflected it back to these young people, they in turn presented at the Art Place final conference. And this young woman who was a dancer said, well, I now have the terminology, the words to describe my intent, so that people that were like funders or policymakers or whatever can understand what I'm trying to do with my dance, versus like I'm just dancing to look like Beyonce or whatever her example was at the time. And so I sort of posed that to this group of like, it's really wonderful to be among colleagues. I love a good set of concentric circles or a good, framework and Venn diagram, but like, what do we do with it and what impact can it actually have in the work? Because let's face it, we write academic papers that only people like ourselves read, and not actually people that are doing the work in communities.
Absolutely. Other questions from the larger gallery that's too big to even fit on my screen? We've got a couple minutes left for this session, so is this a good time to either raise your hand, or if you're feeling a little shy, type it into the chat? I'll pause. So I'll ask another question then while I'm waiting for others to chime in, about if we think about it from whether it's a review panel process about what kinds of things we want to invest in, maybe it's from the typology of a programs and sort of portfolio of investments, maybe it's the kind of actual programs in the real world that Jeff's been working with and referring to. When we think of intangible heritage and preserving things for future generations, how do you see either it's the balance or the approach of trying to set not in stone, but set and memorialize what future generations are going to get to enjoy, as if we are serving them, almost serving them a meal? Or are we trying to take their order, even though they don't exist yet? And we're trying to anticipate and respond to their interests and needs, not knowing what they want. How much of it is flowing towards the future in that direction, and how much of it is sort of flowing back to us in the past from the future? Do we have what kind of mindset do you approach your work with when you think about this? I'm curious to hear. There is a right answer, and I won't tell you what it is. No, I am kidding. But how do you think of this? Is it too difficult? When I first got into this, first got into the field of cultural policy, I was hearing a lot about arts and culture education. And it seemed that arts education, in large part, was being justified as this attempt of people in the future to go back in time and train our children to love the arts, so that in the future, there will be robust demand for the arts. And if we didn't now decide to essentially go back in time and brainwash our kids to love the arts would vanish and fade. And so it was almost explicitly baked in to the motivation here that we are trying to affect the future by investing now and manipulate that future in a sense, rather than be responsive to it and be passive, or to try to anticipate in a more passive sort of way. And I think that holds some really interesting implications for how you'd run a panel and give mission and guidance to what to select and what to invest in. It might change how you would place things in a typology. It might place any of this stuff. I notice Jeff's unmuted, so I'm hoping he wants to chime in.
I was just going to say there's a wonderful term that I'll borrow from a colleague that talks about the arts advocacy industrial complex, which is exactly doing what you're saying, like manipulating these things. And I note that this is being recorded, so I'm going to just speak very cautiously. But I used to work for Live Nation at one of their venues, building education departments, and the remit, which was in compliance with the new national education policy in the Republic of Ireland, was to build education departments to allow for young people to enhance their curriculum. So we had to do curriculum aligned work when The Lion King came through, or when Wicked came through, or Priscilla, Queen of the Desert. That was an interesting one to write curriculum for. But it was housed in the marketing department because Live Nation, multinational corporate, looked at it as a 20-year audience development strategy. And the reality is on a macro level for a private corporation, fine, you do what you do. But when I returned here to the United States and saw the arts advocacy industrial complex advocating for things like that to our public policymakers, and those public policymakers wishing to appeal to their constituents by carrying forward those messages, it did fuel a lot of my research interest into those narratives that are being built, because they are harmful. And what we know from educational psychology, right, as educators, what we say about our work impacts psychosomatically how we actually implement our work. So if we are talking about arts education to bring up, music education to bring up test scores, when it comes time for test prep, will we continue to have band class, or will we send the kids to the test prep? Because in reality, we should continue to have band class so that they continue to improve their skills in team building and perseverance and name your buzzword, right? But the reality is we don't. And that is because of the infrastructure that has been built over years and years. And I would argue that as a result of the last year, now is the time that we take advantage of a great pause, a great disruption, in order to turn the power back over to those who are living it and allow them to actually articulate why we're doing the work that we're doing.
Interesting. Thanks, Jeff. Yeah, I think this is an interesting and potentially thin ice kind of conversation part to tread out onto. Because in some ways, if we're trying to shape future generations' demand, we're sort of trying to frame what the dominant demand and dominant cultural paradigms and value structures are going to be. And what we seem to be doing today is spending a lot of time trying to tear those things down that we inherited. And that today's world in the here and now is shaped in part by those past attempts to shape what we will be valuing today. And now we're trying to undermine that. And what are we doing now to not put ourselves to just sort of Groundhog Day this, or be reenacting the same thing, but with a different dominant paradigm that the future generations will try to be, at least, if not undoing, dancing around and rounding the corners of. And I think that poses some really interesting ethical questions to us in today's shoes.
Doug, I'm going to take a bold step and say that there's a lot of opportunity in the future of cultural policy to move away from some of the canonical, traditional art that will, to be honest, always be funded. There will always be some philanthropic person funding 5 particular key areas of the arts that many large municipalities were set up to fund. But I'm going to be bold and say that there's a lot of art that's not being funded, art and creativity that's not being funded. And a lot of it is shaped by this new media landscape that we're in, that's like, 24/7, full immersive. Let's think about storytelling in different media, like augmented reality, virtual reality environments, YouTubers, TikTok stars, influencers. Many of these people, oftentimes younger folks who are creative and trying to build their audiences using, technology. And so this really interesting creative Venn diagram between the media arts and technology. I would say that there's a lot of opportunity in the future of cultural policy to focus on this all access new media, creative media environment, in addition to existing art forms that we already fund very much so in arts philanthropy, whether it's public dollars, nonprofit or private. So I just want to add that, not to lose sight of this emergent fields that aren't even really being studied. I mean, I wrote a little paper in 2018 about it, but and this is the direction that I think arts education can pivot toward if in many of these unaffordable cities, we want our young people to stay there. They need to have some of these skills that can address technology, but also harness their creativity for telling their stories.
Antoine, thank you. We couldn't end this panel on a better last words than that. So I thank you very much. We are out of time on this panel. We're going to take what is a 10-minute break. We're going to get back here at 3:10 Eastern time for our keynote address from Voldemort Hofstein. And I think Bill Ivey is going to host that one. So I'll see you all at 3:10 in about 10 minutes. Thank you all.
Very good. Great stuff.